All right, so just after I got my driver's license, I happened to be driving pretty fast when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw what you don't want to see, a police car pulling up behind me. So instead of stopping and just pulling over, what I did was hit the gas and turn left and then turn right, and I realized I was in a straight up car chase. I pulled over to the side of the road and I parked my car. I got out of my car and I was like, maybe if, he won't notice that I noticed him. And so I popped my trunk and I picked some random box out of my trunk and I started walking up to this house. At this point, he pulls up behind me, the cop, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm just going over to this house. This is my buddy's house. You didn't see me?" "No, I didn't see you. I'm just taking this box to my buddy's house." He's like, "Okay, I'll watch you." And he watched me go up and ring the doorbell, and I sat there and stood there. I was like, and no one came to the door, luckily, or else I would have looked like a total moron. And then I just left the box there, and I walked back to my car. I'm like, "I guess they're not home." And he looked at me. Well, I'm not even going to tell you what he said to me yet because I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain that in a little bit. It was something that turned my universe upside down. Let's back up. Recent philosophical and psychological studies contend that one of the central ways that you and I as human beings make sense of the world is by telling stories. This is how we answer those core questions we all have as human beings. Who are we? Where are we? What's the problem? What's the solution? Those are like the big worldview questions. Stories are more than entertainment, philosophers tell us. They actually are an explanation of reality. They construct reality for us at times even. N.T. Wright says this: narrative is the most characteristic expression of worldview, going deeper than observation or fragmented remark. Meaning, stories are the things that actually shape what we think about the world and how we experience the world. So a few years ago, I read this book called The 7 Basic Plots by a guy named Christopher Booker, and it changed the way I think about Jesus, and it changed the way I think about all of life. And what his basic idea was, is that there are only 7 stories that humankind has ever told. We tell them to ourselves again and again and again. So here's the 7 basic stories we tell. First, overcoming the monster. Rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and the rebirth. And he says every story, even modern stories, are basically just retelling. So Jaws is the same story as Beowulf, overcoming the monster. Pretty Woman is the same story as Cinderella, rags to riches. The Wizard of Oz is the same as Gone with the Wind, voyage and return, so on and so on and forth. And what he said was there's this small quantity of real fiction in the world. The same images with very little variation have served all the authors who have ever written. Those basic archetypal themes are woven through every story we tell and have told for 5,000 years. So much so that they actually feel like they've been programmed into us almost. So Booker says, so deep and instinctive is our need for those stories that as small children, we've no sooner learned to speak than we begin demanding to be told stories. He then raises this fascinating question. He says, what is astonishing is how incurious we are as to why. What real purpose does it serve? It doesn't even occur to us to ask the question, why is this a reality? And he answers and he says, we have a need to locate reality, explain why we think and behave in this world as we do. That's the point of storytelling. So what does all this have to do with Jesus? Well, one thing we know about Jesus is that he told stories. He was a storyteller, and 1/3 of his recorded teaching ministry in the Gospels are him telling stories, usually called parables. That's not something that is even questioned. James Dunn points out the idea. He says that teacher is the most common title used for Jesus in the Jesus tradition, the Gospels, and that a more accurate title for Jesus than teacher would even be what he calls Mosel or parabolist, one who characteristically spoke in parables. So that's not debated among scholars. What is debated among scholars is why Jesus told the stories he did. What was his aim? Some argue they're like, okay, well, the reason he told these stories is to tell earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Others say it was to hide his real message from those seeking to hurt him. I believe those are good things, but I think the reason Jesus told parables and stories is closer to what Christopher Booker talks about. I think the stories of Jesus are his answers to the deep questions we have as human beings. They help us frame how we see the world and how we understand ourselves, our lives, and the God who's over us. Jesus told parables to literally challenge the status quo, the commonly accepted understandings of both ancient and modern people. His stories actually challenged what people thought about God, salvation, themselves, grace and judgment, work, sex, marriage, money, everything that is common to human life. His stories entered into it, reshuffled the furniture of reality in our brains, summoning those who heard them to actually like a new and better way to be human. So they broke open worldviews, and then they replaced them with the new worldview in a form that was powerful. What I mean is this, like if you watch the Netflix series, The Crown, there's this really great scene in season 1 where Edward, the Duke of Windsor, who's this man who might have been king, had circumstances gone otherwise, he looks on this television set of the queen, who's her coronation. And it's the very moment when she's becoming queen. And in his house, he's got this party outside Paris, and he's throwing a party, everyone's hanging out. And he looks to his guests and he says this great line. He says, "Oils and oaths, orbs and scepters." He looks at his guests and he goes, "Symbol upon symbol, an unfathomable web of arcane mystery and liturgy, blurring so many lines, no clergyman or historian or lawyer could ever untangle any of it." And one of the guests says, "It's crazy," right? And then his response is this. He says, "On the contrary, it's perfectly sane. Who wants transparency when you can have magic? Who wants prose when you can have poetry? Pull away the veil and what are you left with? An ordinary young woman of modest ability and little imagination. But wrap her up like this, anoint her with oil, and presto, what do you have? A goddess." See, this is why Jesus told stories to make his points. Why have prose when you can have poetry? Why flatten something powerful, a reality that cannot be captured in words without an attempt to retain that beauty, right? Bonhoeffer said this, he said, "What a mistake to think that it's the task of theology to unravel God's mystery, to bring it down to the flat, ordinary human wisdom of experience and reason. It is the task of theology solely to preserve God's wonder, to glorify God's mystery as mystery." So this is the thing. Well, Jesus sometimes chose to speak plainly. More often, he sought to retain the mystery and the beauty of God's kingdom through the use of his stories. He captured the imagination of people and the entire world with an alternative reality, something altogether different than what is on offer by the world. And he did it through story, through parable, to free people by first doing what Brian Walsh says is necessary, freeing their imagination. You know, you and I, we're kind of stuck in a world where our imagination needs to be freed. That's what his stories did. Can you imagine yourself living in any other world than you live in? Can you imagine not living for the weekend? Can you imagine that your life could mean something more than just the money you have or the family you have? This is why Jesus told stories, to break open all of that. I love how C.S. Lewis says it in the opening of the Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He has this dedication line, and the dedication line says this. He says, "To my dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you're already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it's printed and bound, you'll be older still." And then he says this, I love it, "But someday, you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again." See, that's what Jesus did. He told stories because if his audience had ears to hear, their old souls would hear a call from a land they had not visited, but one that they knew somehow. Right? This is what he's trying to do. He's kind of singing the words to a song they hadn't heard, but which they could somehow hum. Jesus was uniquely able to reach beneath their reason to their passions, to their desires, and that's what made them powerful. And that power, when it's unleashed, was anything but safe for him or his audience. And it's not safe for us. Are you willing to let his stories totally derail your life and upend it and give it purpose? So in Christopher Booker's analysis of storytelling, he writes that there are many stories which are shaped by more than one basic plot at a time. He says there are even very small number of stories, and then he says including the Lord of the Rings, which include all 7 plots. And I've often thought about that. And one day in my office, I was actually replying to some emails in between meetings, and I thought about one of Jesus' best known stories, the prodigal son. You probably know it, found in Luke 15. And a thought struck me out of nowhere, that what if the reason the prodigal son is probably one of the most known, if not the most known parable Jesus ever told, what if the reason is what Booker said? Because it contains all 7 basic plots in one story. What if that was actually the case? And I opened my Bible and I went to my whiteboard and I wrote out all 7 basic plots at the top, and I started charting out the prodigal son story and putting them under. And what I realized is that this story, among all the stories he told, is known as a great story. It's known for thousands of years. People know that story even if they're not Christians. Why? Because it's about overcoming the monster. It's about rags to riches. It's about there and back again. It's about comedy. It's about tragedy. All of the things that are part of human stories are in that one story. And that's why it's so known and so powerful. So take that story then, the prodigal son story. What is the meaning of it? Well, contrary to popular ideas, it's not about one lost son, as Tim Keller points out. It's actually about 2 lost sons, but they're lost in different ways, right? The first one is lost because he's completely irreligious, and maybe that's some of you. He's like the secular brother, the young atheist, agnostic, whatever, and he just lives how he wants. He doesn't care about God. He's going to do his own thing. I'm going to take the gifts from God, the Father in the story, and I'm going to go live however I want. I don't really care about a relationship at all. And he's got a morally corrupt life, and the story deems him lost, disconnected from the father and from his family. And then you have the older brother, and he's someone that not everybody has recognized as lost throughout history, but he's lost because of religion. He's the conservative. He obeys all God's rules. He's self-righteous. He compares himself to others all the time. Go read the story. It's brilliant. And he ends up at the end, tragically, outside the party, not accepting the Father's gracious invitation. And so this parable, it's not just like a nice sentimental message. It's a controversial, scandalous story where Jesus hints that everything, listen to this, everything that we've believed about God through all human history has been completely wrong. And he has come to give us a new insight, that it's not what we can do for God, but what God has done for us. Running out to meet us, sacrificing his most prized possession, experience shame and mockery himself so that we don't have to. I mean, it's a crazy idea in the marketplace of ideas. It ends, of course, with an amazing celebration for those humble enough to receive grace rather than trying to earn a place for themselves. Those who are welcomed in light of this new moment in history, Jesus says, are people who do not have a record to stand on. They rely on the record of God himself, right? They wear his robe. They wear his ring. They're free and undeserving. And the scandalous generosity of the Father was just as much a challenge or a problem for Jesus' audience as it is today. That scandal, that it's a gift, not earned.